So
Um,
obviously, we had some Microsoft capabilities beforehand,
I see.
but now the whole package comes with Teams built in. So we try and use that as much as possible now.
I see.
Right,
See.
here we go.
All right.
With varying results, I have to say.
I see.
Okay, right. So
Yes.
today's presentation is really about trying to establish some common idea about what research is and what it isn't. And it's usually because students very often get into well, they kind of get the wrong end of the stick in terms of they think they're doing research when they're not, and that leads to a number of misunderstandings and usually not very good projects. So we try and head that off by doing a presentation really early. So I'm going to go a little bit around, what theoretically we're going to ask you to do.
Okay.
I'm going to talk a little bit about why this module is not like any of the other modules, and perhaps you need to reconsider what your working practice is, given that you've done sort of 3 or 4 modules with us so far. And then I'm going to give you a potential alternative, which students aren't always aware of, but it sometimes it sometimes helps the kind of stress levels, shall we say, and I'll explain that a little later on.
Okay.
So I was just trying to work out how I could sum up what a research project is, and actually this sums up a research project at many levels. It is from a textbook which is about doing geography as a dissertation, but the ideas are very much the same. So their quote, which I quite like, goes like this. It says, "This means that in the course of doing your dissertation or project, you will need to find out something. It won't be sufficient to write what you already know about a topic, or even to write what you and everybody else knows. This might sound all a bit daunting, but it isn't. It is challenging, but it's not daunting. Remember, you only have to try and find out something. Anything. It doesn't have to be important or earth-shattering." And there are a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. Very often, students come to the project thinking they're going to solve the problems of essentially of the sector. So they have a very global sense of what they want to do. And really, we need to think of research as a way of being very specific and plumbing the depths, going really deep into a small area, a small topic, than looking very in a shallow way at a very wide subject. So, for example, somebody wanted to do something on kind of global emissions. Or shipping emissions and something to do with global climate change. That's just way too big for a topic like this. So the first bit you're going to do, I think, with your supervisor is talk about the scope of your research. Okay. So think about the size of the project you're going to do and the depth at which you're going to research. And the other thing is, don't worry if it doesn't sound very earth-shattering. It doesn't sound like it's going to be really important. It doesn't sound like it's going to solve anything that's maybe of significance to your workplace. That isn't the point at the moment. Research builds up to that point by lots of small incremental stages, and you are part of that chain.
Okay.
So one of the important things to take away from that as well, which is probably the thing that most confuses students, is the idea that reading and research are not the same thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. That we move forward our knowledge base by making sure that our research question is really focused. And in order to understand what it is that that you don't know, if you like, you need to know what you do know. So that means you've got to find the boundaries of where we are. And where you find the boundaries of where we are is by doing the reading in the first place. So that's quite a complicated cycle. So I just want to unpack those ideas a little bit.
All right.
So the first myth that people have is that this module is just like the other 3 or 4 modules you will have done with us. And it clearly is not. There are a number of very important differences. The most important difference is usually you get very direct assessment questions. Do this, write about that, answer this question. The assessment brief for this module is just complete a piece of research on a topic of your choice. So that's really broad, and part of the challenge is framing what you want to do. So take some time to reflect and think about that and talk about that with your supervisor. You might already have some ideas, which is great, but don't struggle on with that alone, is my advice. Talk to people.
Okay.
The second thing is that just remember that this module takes twice as long as all the other modules to complete. So it takes 2 terms, not 1. And the reason is because it's quite complicated, and it's quite, as you will discover, it is quite difficult to navigate your way through. For example, there are no lectures on content because everybody does a different topic. So you're going to have to educate yourself into that content. There are no lectures to rely on. Very often you look at the person that's tutoring you as a tutor. So you ask them lots of questions. Can you check this? Is this, what does this mean? How does this work? And some of that will still be relevant, but very often your supervisor is a guide through the process rather than the topic itself. So in the end, you should know probably as much, if not a bit more, than your supervisor, perhaps, particularly if your supervisor isn't in the area, an expert in the area you're thinking about. And then finally, and I'm not wishing to cast aspersions on the way that you work, but you might be used to writing your assessment all together at the last minute, maybe, or in a very concentrated period of time towards the end of the term. I would advise you don't do that. You spread out your writing, because the assessment, actually writing the final report, takes an awful lot longer than many people give it credit for. So there are some very distinctive differences between what you're going to do and what you've done before. The second thing is, and this comes back to the reading debate, is that it's just a long form essay of around 7,500 to 10,000 words. It isn't. Reading, as I've suggested, forms the start of the process. So it is the process by which you understand what we already know, and it shows you the gaps that you can fill in by your own collection of information and your own argument. We are probably not our own best friends here, because we will often say to you as a student, go away and do your research. You might have even heard people say, when they're talking about COVID or climate change, I've done my research, they say. What they mean is they've watched some stuff on YouTube and read a few reports. So research is a process. It isn't a thing, isn't an entity. So reading is the start, and it's certainly not the whole part of the process. So the important thing to note, and this is where many students fall down, is all they do is they write something that is already known. And to turn that into a piece of research is quite complicated. And there are 2 ways that you can do that, and I'll cover them in a second. The third thing that students often do, and we fully appreciate you are professional people working hard with personal commitments as well, you're not like traditional 18 to 21-year-old students, is that time is really difficult to find, to carve out for study work. And so that might tend to force you into a just-in-time kind of approach. If you can avoid that at all costs, I would recommend it. because research as a process takes quite a lot longer to go through that cycle. Just the process of writing up may take you weeks and not days. So you have to be sure you can devote time and effort to it. The other thing, of course, is remember that for many students, the process is very new to you. You might not have done a dissertation or a project report before. So you need to get advice. So you need to kind of be able to stagger the timeframes between yourselves and us so that you can give us information, we can read it, we can look at it, we can give you our thoughts, you can go and act on it and then come back to us. And that is just it just saps time, that cycle. So build that into your thinking.
Yes, sir. All right.
So the fourth myth is that just reading will do and you don't need data. So this is the way that you move from knowing what you do know to what you don't know. To find out something that you don't know, you need to base your research on something, and typically we call that data. So data can take a number of forms. We can have primary data, and that's data that is newly acquired by you. So nobody has ever known it. You are the person who generates it. And you can have lots of different forms of primary data collection. In my area, because I'm an environmental scientist, I would go and take water samples or soil samples and put them in the lab. If you're a social scientist, you would run surveys and do interviews and talk to people. You might also have data that you have access to, databases, mapping products, I don't know, previous surveys that nobody has really analysed, and you're going to analyse them differently. We call that data that already exists but hasn't really been looked at in the way that you want to look at it, secondary data. There is a final way of looking at reading as data, and that is if you use the literature as the information, the evidence behind your argument. So perhaps you have a new angle of looking at a particular problem within the shipping industry. Perhaps you want to use a new analytical technique. That's quite a challenge and quite a hard way of doing a desk study, because it requires you to read even more deeply, even more widely, and really be sure of the analytical tool that you're going to look at. So, for example, some people might look at staffing and crewing management issues from a feminist perspective. So they'll have a theoretical body of knowledge behind them around feminism, and they'll apply that to what they see in the literature about crew management. That's quite a challenging way of doing things, and most of our students usually opt for getting some primary data or secondary data into their research. Again, talk to your supervisor. Make sure that you are secure in the knowledge of how you're going to collect this new information. The fifth myth is that you can't graduate without a without a project. So this is a slight get out for students who, once they've seen this presentation, think, I'm really not sure I can do this. I can't really devote the time to it. Because you've got to this point, you should be fairly confident that you can, that intellectually you can complete a project. But because of the mechanics of doing such a piece of work, it may be that this is a little bit beyond you. And that's where the course design has really helped you out here. Back in the day when I was a student, you enrolled on what was called an ordinary degree. And at some point you upgraded to an honours degree. Most universities these days enroll people at the honours stage. Most people get honours degrees. However, there is a position in our regulations that says that if you don't do our project module, you can still graduate, but with an ordinary rather than an honours degree. So that seems a strange situation, because it says that it's perfectly acceptable for you not to do the module. But there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of. When you get an ordinary degree, we give you a degree certificate, and we don't classify you in any way. It's a pass or a fail, okay, on your degree, and you can use the letters after your name, BSc. If you get an honours degree, you get BSc Hons, signifying the honours, but we classify you into a third, 2-2, 2-1, and a first. Now, depending upon what you want to do next, that may be important to you. For many traditional UK students, getting a classified degree is important because it enhances job prospects going forward. But remember, these people are not in work. For you, it might be that just getting a degree is absolutely fine, in which case you might decide to sidestep the stress of doing a research project. For people who want to do a master's, usually, certainly in the UK setting and probably in the European setting, you would be asked to get an honours degree that is 2-2 and above. Okay, so that might be something you might want to consider. And also, if you do a master's project, you will have to do a research thesis, and so practice is very useful. The choice is completely down to you. If after a period of reflection or a period of time you think, you know, I really can't do this. You know, it's not something I particularly want to do. It's not something I have to do. You know, work has got super busy all of a sudden, and actually that's seems to be very true this term for many people in the shipping sector. The world seems to be waking up quite significantly after COVID. Then we fully understand that people have to make that kind of personal and professional judgment. So, you know, we don't judge you at all. It is something that a decision that we respect, that you are making in a perfectly mature and sensible way. There is a point at which we may say, please don't continue with the project. And that's at a point within the process that I'll talk about in a second.
Okay.
So I think in order to succeed, you need three capabilities. You need to be inquisitive. You need to, you know, want to know something about your industry and about the topic you're looking at. Otherwise, it becomes a chore and it becomes very boring. You do need quite a degree of self-motivation, but actually that's not something we come across too often as being a problem in our students, because the fact that you are working and studying and you've got this far means that you are motivated, but that isn't always true with kind of 18 to 21-year-olds. And you also need to be able to understand the research literature, and that is an important part. You know, people spend a lot of time going through industry material, stuff from the IMO, from UNCTAD, and that's all great, but the real key references are in the more complicated research literature, so you do have to be able to get to grips with that. So let's talk a little bit about the process. So the process is 26 weeks long, and it's 26 weeks long because there's a lot of work involved. It's a double credit module for that reason. It requires you to be, I think, methodical and consistent in your commitment. So I would suggest when you sit down with your supervisor, particularly when you get into the research phase, perhaps you actually pencil in meetings ahead of time, you know, maybe once every 3 weeks, and you put that in your diary as much as you can based upon, you know, your schedule. Many students like to complete their taught modules very often without any intervention with their supervisor at all. Probably the only thing you will do is send a draft. I would highly advise you don't do that. I would highly advise that you talk to a supervisor in a fairly consistent and constant manner. I even did that when I did a PhD thesis. We met once a week and we talked about what we were doing. Okay, so it is really important that you talk to people, even if it's for 20 minutes to try and sort out some problems or issues, or just go over your thoughts and feelings about what you've discovered so far.
Yes.
So the first bit that you have to do really is to pick a topic. And there are a number of ways we can do that. You might have a personal interest on the course or in an allied subject outside of that from work, and you think that might be a good area that you wish to collect some information on. You might already have access to a group of people or a group of samples that you can look at, or data that you can analyze. So that makes sense. You might have access to other people, and that they would be a good target audience to go and chat to. But once you've got that broad idea down and you've kind of talked to your supervisor about it, what you need to do is actually start get reading, get into the library, get onto Primo, onto Google Scholar, and just collect some information and read and read and read. And as somebody who doesn't like reading very much, this is the most painful bit of the project. Okay, so I feel your pain when people say that it gets really boring and dull, but unfortunately, it's a bit of the job that has to happen. Okay, so here are a few ways you might find a research question. The first one is the way that people look at it, and I always say, whatever you do, don't do this. No one has ever looked at this. I think I'll have a go. If nobody's ever looked at it, you have no idea of what the boundaries of knowledge are. So it just becomes really hard. Plus the fact, when you got some answers back from your data collection, how do you know whether they're any good? Because you've got nothing to compare and contrast with. So always base your research project ideas within the bounds of something you may have read. So you could have read something and let's say I'd gone out, I'd found something, I'd published my results, but I said, oh, these might have been influenced by, I don't know, the weather or something like that. So what you do is you investigate the role of the weather on that topic. It could be that I've gone out and I've reported some results, but you think, in your opinion, that I've ignored the possible effects of weather. So you go out and you investigate weather and the impact of weather on whatever I've been collecting. It could be that you do your research in a different spatial location. What you get in one place is not the same as what you get in somewhere else. That's true for the environmental world. That Singapore, I look at sediments off the coast of Singapore and off the coast of Portugal, they're not going to be the same.
Yes.
What can I do in terms of comparing and contrasting them? But it's also true culturally and socially. So it could also be true of talking to different people in different locations. Similarly, things change, particularly in the shipping sector. They change really rapidly, as you know. So what we find out, what we found out 10 years ago may have significantly changed. If you think of, maybe something to do with the industry before, post and pre-COVID, and look at the impact of COVID, that's a worthy research angle.
Yes.
In the more scientific sense, we have lots of different methods, and sometimes using one method over another method gives you slightly different results and different answers. So you might want to just look at whether you get similar responses using different methodologies. And then, of course, things are time bound and new data becomes available. So the question is, you look at the new data and you say, well, are those ideas still valid? Once you've kind of put all that together and you've got an idea of the framing of your research, go and write your abstract and post it up to the forum. So that will be the first task that you have to do, and that task is actually marked.
Okay.
So there are other tasks that you need to do. Some of them are marked and some of them are not. So let's have a look at those very briefly. So once you've got an idea and an abstract written, it doesn't have to be very long, maybe a couple of 100 words. Write that down on the forum. Make sure that you've got your research question there, what you might do, what your general plan is. Nobody's going to hold you to it, okay? So don't worry, but it's your ideas. Then the idea of that forum exercise is to look at what other people have written.
Yeah.
Give them some feedback, and they should be giving some feedback to you, and you should respond to that feedback, and it should help you try and develop your ideas. We actually mark that. We give that a small mark, so it is a summative piece of research, of work, sorry. Then there are some formative pieces of work. So by formative, we mean we ask you to do them, but we don't give them a grade. They are for information only. So what they do is they document your progress, and they also allow us to give you some quite pointed feedback. The most important bits are the next two bits. So the next thing you do is you talk to your supervisor about how you're going to do your research, and you have to submit something called an ethical approval form.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about the ethical approval form at a moment because it is crucial. Okay, so I'm dedicating a whole slide to that. So I'll come back to that in a second. Okay. Once you know what you're doing and how you're going to do it, write the proposal, work on it with your supervisor, and you get it accepted. If you don't have a proposal that isn't accepted, or you don't write one at all, we will come back to you. We will investigate it. We might give you a bit more time, okay? Because there's no deadlines as such, but the quicker you can do it, the better. But if we don't think you have a project that's viable, we may interrupt you, okay? So we may take the decision to do the project away from you.
Okay.
Then quite simply, I say quite simply because it's one bullet point, but actually it forms the majority of your work. You go away, you do the research, you write it up, and then you present your findings. And we then assess you in two ways. We ask you to write a project report, and then we ask you to do a presentation. But that's kind of 26 weeks in the future, so we're not worried too much about that. Let's go back a few steps and think about ethical approval.
Okay.
Research ethics are incredibly important, and you will find that some scientists in particular, particularly environmental scientists, may say that their research doesn't have an ethical dimension. That's not strictly true. All research has an ethical dimension, but some of it might be highly impactful and important, and some of it may not be. So what we ask you to do is we ask you to fill out a form that shows that you understand this, and you self-declare whether there are ethical issues that might arise and gain clearance anywhere where that might be the case. Now, there are some extreme cases that none of our students do and probably will or should get involved with. For example, testing on animals clearly has an ethical dimension. But so we're not really interested in that side. What we're interested in is when you involve human participation. So let's say you do a survey or you do interviews. And the ethical dimension comes around things like data protection. Because sometimes you're asking sometimes quite personal questions, but also, you know, just any kind of detail from individuals should be curated and collected and stored and destroyed in an ethically robust manner. So we're going to ask you to fill out a form. Now, it might be that by the time you've looked at that form, you'll go, there are no ethical problems for me to flag up, which is fine. Or you might include details of how you're going to anonymize
the research data. Hello. 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 So, are you there? Hello. Hello. Oh, I lost some connection there. Okay, you're back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, so you can talk about your ethics release form with your supervisor. It then goes to a committee, which I sit on and Jamie sits on, and
Okay.
we just, we just approve it or not, and it's relatively straightforward. But if you don't do it and you don't do it properly, we will reject it and we won't allow you to carry on your research until you've done it properly. Okay. So
Okay.
it
Okay.
is really important.
Okay.
Okay, so right, so we were near the end anyway.
Okay.
So let's summarize everything. So in summary, don't treat this module like any other module. It is very different. It takes longer. It probably demands of you slightly different skills, slightly different time commitment as well, I would suggest. But partly by doing that, I think it's probably a really enriching academic experience. The onus for doing the work is definitely more with you than it is with us, but we have 20, 30 years of supervising and doing these projects. So come to us and ask us for questions, because you will sometimes not understand, misunderstand, not know, just want to get something sorted out in your head. So we're much more, we're less leading and more sitting beside you, I suppose, on this.
Okay.
The first thing is you need to know when you do research is you need to be able to set out what the parameters and the boundaries of what we already know are, and that's reading, and that's where reading gets you. It isn't the be all and end all of research. It is a thoughtful and reflective process, and that makes it quite challenging. And the challenge starts virtually this week by sitting down and thinking about what you want to do. If on reflection you all think that this is a bit too much, or it doesn't appeal, but you think that the ordinary degree, just getting the ordinary degree is fine, and you're quite happy with that, come and talk to us and we can do the paperwork. And as I say, we fully respect people's decision to make that choice, but be aware that there are some implications of that choice if you want to carry on afterwards. Okay, so there it is, quite a lot to take in.
Yes.
I'm going to stop recording now, and then if you've got any questions, I will take them. So let's just
Okay.
starting.